O my brethren, draw nigh, for the hour is late, and the candlelight trembles on these weathered boards, casting shadows that writhe like spectres of unrepented sins. The rain weeps soft over forgotten graves beyond these wooden walls, where the hum of old hymns lingers behind closed doors, and guilt echoes through the silence, heavy as a judgment. I stand before ye, a preacher haunted by truths too dire for daylight, my voice a thunder wrapped in prayer, to confess a tale of wrath and woe, etched in blood upon the cursed soil of Savannah, Georgia. On the night of August 14th, 1827, in the shadowed study of Willow Brook Plantation, Eliza Hawthorne met his end, his skull shattered, bone fragments driven into an oak desk 6 feet hence, as if the Almighty's hand had descended in vengeance. The coroner's quill preserved in Chatham County archives speaks of wounds wrought by hands of unearthly might beyond mortal measure. The accused was Eliza Hawthorne, a woman 6 feet and 8 inches tall, a colossus of sorrow and sinew, who vanished into the August night like a spirit fleeing eternal judgment. For nigh 2 centuries men have whispered her name, debating whether she was flesh or fable, born of fear and guilt. Yet the records, sale papers, medical notes, trembling testimonies proclaim a truth more fearsome. She was real, and what transpired in that study was the harvest of a horror sown in chains. If this tale of dark history and forbidden defiance stirs thy soul, ye listeners of forgotten liturgy, strike that subscribe button and speak in the comments from what city or state ye hear this confession. I read each word ye send, and it kindles my weary heart to know these lost liturgies reach across this shadowed land. Now, let us tread the mire, where footsteps echo through wet halls, and the sins of men reap a bitter crop.
The tale of Eliza Hawthorne begins not with blood, but with coin, filthy lucre stained by the trade in human souls. In the spring of 1823, Savannah's port throbbed like a fevered heart, ships groaning into harbor from the Caribbean, West Africa, and Virginia's tobacco fields, their holds heavy with human cargo. Bay Street and Factor's Walk were altars to Mammon, where men bartered lives with the cold efficiency of cotton bales or rice barrels. The cotton plantations encircling Savannah were crucibles of torment, fields where the sun scorched the soul, where mosquitoes bore death and serpents slithered through the mire. Historical reckonings hold that nigh 30% of the enslaved perished in their first year, their bodies broken by labor so brutal it mocked God's mercy. The work was a relentless scourge, hours bent under a blazing sky, ankles sunk in mud, hands torn by fawns, lungs choked by swamp air thick with pestilence. Planters, ravenous for flesh to feed their fields, sent traders scouring the South for the strong, the enduring, those who could survive hell and still toil. And sometimes these traders found a soul apart, a rarity to be sold for a king's ransom, a soul whose very existence seemed to defy the natural order. In March of 1823, Caleb Rutherford, a trader hardened by years of trafficking in human misery, came to Savannah with a coffle of 37 souls, bought from the desperation of Virginia and North Carolina. Among them stood a young woman, scarce 20 years, who drew every eye like a shadow cast by a gathering storm. She stood nigh 7 feet, her frame broad as an oak, muscled like a beast of burden, her hands so vast they could cradle a man's head like a child's toy. Auction records name her Eliza, no surname for those deemed property bore none. Born on a small farm in Piedmont, North Carolina, to a mother lost to history's silence, Eliza carried a burden modern physicians call pituitary gigantism, a malady of unchecked growth born of a tumor's silent work. But in 1823, no such knowledge existed. To those who gazed upon her, she was a marvel, a monstrosity, a prize to be won, a spectacle to draw gasps and coin alike. On a humid Tuesday morn, the auction house on Bay Street swelled with planters, merchants, and gawkers, drawn by whispers of the giantess. The air hung heavy, thick with sweat and anticipation, as Eliza stepped onto the block, shackled at wrist and ankle, her chains clanking like a dirge. A murmur rose, stifled like a hymn choked by fear, as she towered over James Vanderhurst, the auctioneer, a man seasoned by countless sales, who later confessed to friends he had never seen her like. The bidding began at $400, a weighty sum for any soul, but it soared, 600, 800, then 1,000, as planters vied not for a laborer, but a spectacle to parade before their peers. From the room's rear came the final bid, from Eliza Hawthorne, a cotton planter of 42 years, widowed, iron-fisted, known among his kind for ruling his plantation with a cruelty that brooked no softness. He paid $1,300 for Eliza Hawthorne, among the highest sums ever recorded in Savannah that year. As she was led from the block, wrists bound with Thorne's mark burned into a leather collar, she made no sound, no cry, no protest. Her dark eyes stared ahead, unreadable, her massive frame moving with grace that belied her chains, as if she walked not to bondage, but to some unseen judgment. None knew they witnessed the prelude to a reckoning, a story to end in blood and mystery. Yet one voice pierced the silence, an old, free black woman, selling flowers by the market, whose trembling hands clutched a Bible as she watched Thorne lead Eliza to his wagon. She whispered, low and fervent, "That man hath bought his own death." Willowbrook Plantation, 18 miles southwest of Savannah, was a kingdom of cruelty, its fields stretching toward the Ogeechee River, cradled by tidal swamps and serpentine waters that whispered of secrets older than man. The main house, Georgian in style, stood proud with white columns and a veranda gazing over cotton rows, its beauty a cruel mask over a charnel ground. Behind it lay the kitchen, overseer's cottage, barn, cotton gin, and 12 slave cabins, rough-hewn timber, dirt-floored, windowless, where hope withered under despair's weight. The fields, vast and merciless, drank the blood of those who toiled, fed by ditches and channels that tamed the swamp's wild waters. The air was thick with the hum of insects, the distant croak of frogs, and the faint echo of hymns sung in secret, as if the earth itself mourned the souls bound to it. Eliza arrived at Willowbrook in late March, assigned to Cabin 7 with 5 other women, their shadows flickering by candlelight on the rough walls. Porter Grimble, the overseer, a wiry man with nervous eyes, quailed at her size. In a letter to his brother, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society, he wrote of her as a creature of unnatural dimensions, stooping to enter the cabin, resembling some ancient colossus more than a Christian soul. His words trembled on the page, as if the act of describing her invoked a fear he could not name. But Eliza Hawthorne had not paid a fortune for field labor alone. Within days he began exhibiting Eliza, summoning planters, merchants, and travelers to Willowbrook to behold his prize. By candlelight in the parlor, where shadows danced on old wood, or on the veranda under a sky heavy with stars, she was made to stand, to lift barrels of cotton weighing 300 pounds, iron anvils that groaned under their own weight, even full-grown hogs that squealed in her grasp. Thorne stood beside her, his stature dwarfed, his voice commanding as he bid men lay their hands in hers to marvel at their size, their calluses a testament to her toil. Dr. Edmund Porcher, a Savannah physician, visited in May 1823 and wrote in his diary, preserved for posterity, "Mr. Thorne hath acquired a female of extraordinary proportions, nigh 7 feet, her hands and feet defying measurement. She lifted a cotton barrel with ease, as if mocking the limits of mortal strength. I felt an unease, as if nature herself had transgressed the bounds of humanity, and I confess the sight stirred a dread I cannot fully name. For Eliza, these displays were but the prelude to her torment. When not paraded like a beast in a menagerie, she toiled in the fields, where the sun blazed without mercy, the earth crawled with serpents, and the air hummed with mosquitoes that carried death in their wings. Cotton work demanded 10 to 12 hours daily, bent beneath a sky that offered no reprieve, ankles sunk in mud, hands torn by thorns, lungs choked by swamp air. The labor was a crucible, breaking most within months, yet Eliza endured. Her size made her a marvel. She hauled loads meant for 3 men, wielded heavy wooden tools with a power that awed even Grimble, but it also made her a target. Thorn, eager to prove his dominion, chose her for punishment when defiance stirred among the enslaved, not for her sins, but to show none were beyond his lash. Whipping posts, their wood stained with blood, stood as sentinels of his cruelty. Stocks held bodies in rigid agony. The buck, a device to bind knees and arms, forced the victim into a posture of torment for hours. Eliza knew them all. Grimble's letters record 3 public punishments in her first year for insolence or refusing to be exhibited, each lash a sermon of submission meant to break her. Yet Eliza did not break as Thorn wished. Her silence during these ordeals was a defiance louder than any cry, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point, as if communing with a justice beyond the plantation's reach. The enslaved at Willowbrook spoke of her in hushed reverence, their testimonies gathered years later under the weight of freedom's fragile dawn. They were her shield and their fear, moving massive irrigation gates that controlled the swamp's waters, hauling timber for repairs, lifting wagons from the mire with a strength that seemed to defy God's design. She stood between the overseer's whip and children too young to toil, taking blows meant for others, her back a map of scars that told of her sacrifice. When Thorn sought to tear mothers from their young for sale to distant plantations, Eliza stood, silent and immovable, a wall against his will. Her voice, rare and low, carried an authority no chain could bind, resonating like a hymn sung in secret behind closed doors. The older among the enslaved called her Tall Eliza, or simply the Wall. For once she planted her feet, only force could shift her, and force, Thorn began to learn, was not always enough.
In the summer of 1824, some 15 months after her arrival, the first true clash came, a moment that would echo through the years like footsteps in wet halls. Augustus Peyton, a Savannah gentleman with a taste for curiosities, offered Thorn $300 to display Eliza for 2 weeks in a traveling exhibition of nature's oddities, preserved specimens, mechanical marvels, and Eliza as the living centerpiece. Thorn, eager for coin and the chance to raise his name among Savannah's elite, agreed without hesitation. He summoned Eliza to the main house, where candlelight flickered on old wood, and commanded her to prepare for the journey. She stood before him, her shadow swallowing the room, and said, soft as a prayer whispered over a Bible, "I will not go." Thorn, stunned by her defiance, repeated the order, his voice rising like thunder over the fields. Eliza stood firm, her refusal a quiet hymn of rebellion that seemed to shake the very walls. Enraged, Thorn summoned Grimble, ordering her to the whipping post, his face flushed with the humiliation of being defied by one he deemed property. What followed became a legend whispered in the quarters, a tale of resistance that burned brighter than the candles that lit their nights.
4 men, Grimble among them, tried to drag Eliza to the post, their hands grasping at her arms, their boots slipping in the dirt. She became stone, unyielding, her feet planted as if rooted in the earth itself. Fists struck her, canes bruised her flesh, yet she did not move. It took 8 men, ropes taut as sin, and threats to harm others among the enslaved, to force her steps to the post. 30 lashes tore her back, blood soaking her rough cotton dress, staining the ground like an offering to some forgotten deity. Yet she made no sound, her silence a sermon louder than any cry, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeing a judgment yet to come. Released, she walked to her cabin, unbowed, her spine straight as the pillars of justice. Thorne, shamed before his men and the enslaved, cancelled the exhibition, claiming illness, his voice trembling with a fear he dared not name. The enslaved saw, and their whispers grew. Eliza could bleed, but she could make Elijah Thorne falter, a crack in the iron of his rule that would never mend. An uneasy truce settled over Willowbrook, fragile as the candlelight that flickered in the cabins each night. Thorne continued to exhibit Eliza to visitors who came to gape, but he dared not send her abroad, as if sensing that her defiance could ignite a fire he could not extinguish. She worked the fields, her strength unbroken, her hands moving through the cotton rows with a power that seemed to mock the chains that bound her. Punishments grew rarer, as if Thorne understood that each lash diminished his authority rather than reinforced it. Each scar on her back a testament to his failure to break her. Yet, beneath this surface calm, a darker tide swelled, gathering strength like a storm over the swamps, set to break on a sweltering August night in 1827. For in the spring of 1826, Eliza became pregnant, and the weight of that new life would alter the course of her story forever. The father, known only through the whispers of the enslaved, was Marcus, a carpenter of 30 years, skilled in mending the intricate woodwork of cotton gins and irrigation systems. Purchased from a Brunswick estate 2 years before Eliza, he was a man of quiet thought, his eyes shadowed by the loss of a wife and daughter sold away in years past, their faces haunting his dreams. His hands, calloused from years of crafting, could build anything, a cradle, a door, a life, yet they could not reclaim what had been taken. Eliza and Marcus found in each other a sacred alliance, a bond forged not in passion, but in the shared defiance of a world that sought to strip them of all humanity. In the evenings, as the swamp's chorus rose and the candlelight flickered in cabin 7, Marcus spoke of places he had seen, of bridges he had built, of dreams that lingered despite the chains. Eliza, whose own mother's face had faded to a shadow in her memory, listened, her silence a sanctuary for his words.
When Eliza learned she carried a child, the news spread through the quarters like a hymn sung in secret, its notes both hope and dread. A child was a flicker of light in the darkness, a promise of continuity in a world that offered none. Yet it was also a curse, another soul to be bound, sold or broken by the whims of men like Thorne. On a plantation ruled by his iron fist, a child was a vulnerability, a lever to be used against the heart. Eliza's size, the very trait that made her valuable, made pregnancy a trial of endurance. Her steps grew slower, her hands pressed to her lower back as pain flickered across her face, a rare crack in her stoic mask. Thorne, ever the profiteer, saw not a mother but a ledger entry, boasting to visitors of a child born to a giantess, speculating on its size and the price it might fetch. These words, carried back to the quarters by house servants, struck Eliza like a lash deeper than any whip, a dread that settled in her bones like the damp of the swamp. To lose her labor, her dignity, her body was one thing.
To lose her child to Thorne's greed was a wound she could not bear. In November 1826, as the air grew chill and the fields lay fallow, Thorne spared Eliza the back-breaking work of the cotton rows, assigning her lighter tasks, ginning cotton in the barn, mending torn garments, tending the kitchen garden where herbs grew in defiance of the swamp's decay. Her belly swelled, enormous even for her frame, and when she stood in the doorway of the kitchen building, her shadow blocked the sun, as if the world itself paused in her presence. Yet even in this diminished state, she remained a tower of strength, her hands steady as they worked, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if communing with a future only she could see. The birth came on a bitter January night in 1827, when frost rimed the fields and the swamp's breath hung heavy in the air. Labor seized Eliza just after midnight, her cries piercing the stillness, a sound that carried across the frozen fields and roused Thorne from his slumber in the main house. Attended by two midwives, Hester and Dina, women whose hands had brought forth life under the shadow of death, Eliza screamed, a sound that shook the wooden walls of Cabin 7 and seemed to call down the wrath of heaven itself. Thorne, drawn by the noise, lit a lantern and stood outside the cabin, his shadow flickering on the dirt, listening as if to weigh the value of the life within. Just before dawn, a boy was born, 11 pounds, healthy, his cries a fragile hymn in the cold air. Hester, her hands trembling over a Bible hidden beneath her apron, testified years later that Eliza wept, the first tears ever seen, as she cradled her son, examining his tiny hands, his face, whispering words lost to all but the Almighty. Marcus was allowed to enter soon after, his steps slow, his eyes heavy with the weight of their shared burden. As he stood beside Eliza, looking down at the child, something passed between them, a silent vow, a liturgy of resolution that needed no words.
Eliza named the boy Jacob, a biblical name heavy with connotations of struggle and survival, a name that echoed the wrestlings of patriarchs with angels and with God. For a few brief weeks, despite the chains that bound them, Cabin 7 held a flicker of joy, a fragile light in the darkness. Eliza nursed Jacob, holding him for hours, singing to him in a voice low and resonant, like distant thunder rolling over the swamps. Marcus, his hands skilled in creation, carved small wooden animals, a horse, a bird, a deer, for the cradle he had built, each piece a prayer for a future they could scarcely imagine. But even in these moments the shadow of Eliza Hawthorne loomed, his ledger open, his eyes ever calculating. By the summer of 1827, Jacob was 6 months old, growing swiftly, larger than most babes his age, his chubby hands reaching for the world with a curiosity that broke Eliza's heart. She had returned to lighter work, mending, gardening, tasks that allowed her to keep Jacob close, slung on her hip or back, never letting him stray from her sight. Marcus, using scraps of wood and his quiet skill, built a better cabin for them, a real door with a latch, a small window with shutters, a frail sanctuary within the prison of Willowbrook. It was still a slave cabin, its walls rough and its floor dirt, but it was theirs, a space where they tried to weave something resembling a family, fragile as a candle's flame in a storm. But Eliza Hawthorne's fortunes were crumbling, and the weight of his debts pressed harder than any whip. The cotton market, unstable for years, had faltered, and disastrous investments in a shipping venture had left him owing sums he could not pay. By July 1827, Willowbrook teetered on the edge of ruin, creditors circling like vultures over a dying beast. Thorne's solution was as cold as it was predictable. Sell his enslaved workers to raise capital. 5 or 6 souls, he calculated, could clear enough to save his plantation. The question was not whether to sell, but whom.
On a humid Tuesday afternoon in early August, Nathaniel Gadsden, a slave trader known for his ruthless bargains, arrived at Willowbrook in a wagon that creaked under the weight of his greed. Gadsden was a familiar figure in Savannah's markets, a man who bought from struggling planters and sold to those in Florida and Alabama, caring little for the families he tore apart. Thorne and Gadsden walked the plantation, inspecting the enslaved like livestock, discussing ages, skills, and prices as if bartering for hogs or cotton bales. Their footsteps echoed through the wet halls of the main house, a sound that carried to the quarters, where fear hung heavier than the swamp's humidity. Near the kitchen garden, where Eliza worked with Jacob slung on her back, Gadsden stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in her towering form.
"Lord Almighty, is that the giant woman I heard tell of?" he asked, his voice thick with avarice. "That is Eliza," Thorne replied, pride and calculation in his tone. 6'8", my strongest worker. "And the child?" Gadsden's gaze shifted to Jacob, sleeping in his sling, unaware of the transaction that would shape his fate. "Her son, 6 months old," Thorne said, his voice steady but his eyes flickering with the weight of opportunity. Gadsden circled Eliza, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his eyes appraising her as one might a prize mare. She continued her work, her face blank as stone, but her hands stilled on the hoe, her body rigid as if braced for a blow. "How much for the child?" Gadsden asked, his words cutting through the air like a lash. Thorne hesitated, the question catching him unawares. "I had not considered selling him separately," he said, but the lie was thin, his mind already turning over the profit. "I have a buyer in Charleston," Gadsden pressed, his voice smooth as a serpent's. "A wealthy family seeking a house servant to train from infancy. Light work, good conditions. $400, cash, today." Silence fell, heavy as a judgment, the air thick with the hum of unseen hymns. Eliza turned slowly, her eyes empty, her face a mask that hid a storm. Thorne looked at her, then back to Gadsden, his hands trembling slightly, as if clutching a Bible he dare not open. "I must consider this," he said, but the words were hollow. Every soul at Willowbrook knew $400 outweighed a child's life in Elijah Thorne's ledger. That night in Cabin 7, as the candlelight flickered and the rain whispered over forgotten graves, Marcus and Eliza spoke in urgent whispers, their voices a forbidden liturgy of desperation. No one knows the exact words they exchanged, but the decision they reached would echo through history, a hymn of defiance that would shake the foundations of Willowbrook. Dawn brought calamity. Marcus was gone, fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a map sewn into his coat's lining, drawn in his careful hand, marking the paths from Willowbrook to Savannah. With it was a letter addressed to any who might help, pleading for intervention to save Jacob from sale, a desperate cry scrawled in the dim light of their shared resolve. It was a plan born of hopelessness, doomed to fail in a world where roads were patrolled, slave catchers roamed with dogs, and the punishment for runaways was a savagery that mocked mercy. Thorne was informed of Marcus's disappearance just after dawn, his reaction a storm of rage that shook the main house. He ordered Grimble to organize a search party, to summon the slave patrol, to send riders to Savannah to watch the roads. The plantation descended into chaos, men on horseback crashing through swamps and fields, their torches casting flickering shadows like spirits of vengeance. By noon the dogs had tracked Marcus to a creek 8 miles from Willowbrook, his trail clear in the soft mud. They brought him back, bound with ropes, bleeding from bites on his arms and legs, his face drawn but his eyes unbowed. Thorne ordered him taken to the whipping post immediately, announcing he would administer the punishment himself, a spectacle to warn any who dared dream of freedom.
The enslaved were forced to gather, their footsteps heavy in the wet earth, their silence a hymn of shared sorrow. Eliza stood at the front, Jacob crying in her arms, his small voice a counterpoint to the crack of the whip. Thorne delivered 50 lashes, his arms swinging with the full force of his fury, the heavy leather tearing Marcus's back until blood flowed like a river, staining the ground.
After the 5th lash, blood appeared. After the 10th, skin tore open. After the 20th, Marcus hung limp, his screams silenced, his body a testament to Thorne's cruelty. Eliza watched, her face carved from stone, her arms wrapped around Jacob, whose cries grew frantic in the atmosphere of violence. Witnesses later testified that her eyes never left Marcus's face, and in the fleeting moments when he was conscious, he looked only at her, their gaze a silent vow that needed no words. When it was over, Marcus was cut down and dragged to his cabin, barely alive, his back a ruin of flesh. Thorne, flushed and sweating, blood flecks on his shirt, addressed the crowd, his voice a thunder of warning. "Any who aid or run away, any who know of such plans and do not speak, will suffer this fate," he declared, his words echoing through the silence like guilt through a confessional. Then he dismissed them, all but Eliza. He approached her, his average height childlike beside her towering form, his voice cold as the grave. "Tomorrow morning, Mr. Gadsden returns, and he will take your son. You will not resist. You will hand the child over quietly. If you cause any trouble, if you make any scene, I will have Marcus beaten again, and this time he will not survive it. Do you understand me?" Eliza said nothing, her dark eyes meeting his, unreadable as a closed Bible. After a long moment, Thorne turned and walked back to the main house, his footsteps echoing in the wet halls, unaware that he had just pronounced his own sentence. That night, Willowbrook was unnaturally still, the swamp's usual chorus muted, as if the world held its breath. In cabin 7, Eliza sat on the dirt floor, rocking Jacob as he slept, her massive hands gentle as a prayer. In another cabin, Marcus lay on his stomach, his back treated with grease and herbs by trembling hands, drifting in and out of consciousness, his pain a hymn of endurance. In the main house, Thorne sat in his study, the candlelight flickering on old wood, his hands trembling over his account books as he calculated the $400 that would ease his debts. He sipped brandy, glancing out the window toward the slave quarters, his face troubled despite his certainty. None knew that the next night would end in blood, a mystery that would haunt the coastal plain for generations. August 14th, 1827 dawned hot and oppressively humid, the sun rising blood-red over the cotton fields, filtered through a haze of swamp moisture, as if nature itself warned of the coming wrath. Eliza rose before dawn, as was her custom, nursing Jacob, changing him into the cleanest clothes she had, a small cotton gown she had sewn herself, her hands trembling as if clutching a Bible. She held him close, whispering words no one else heard, her voice a low hymn of love and loss. Then she placed him in the wooden cradle Marcus had built and went to work in the kitchen garden, her movements mechanical, her face expressionless, as if she had retreated to some inner sanctuary where pain could not reach. All morning she worked with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic, her hands steady as they pulled weeds or turned soil, her silence a wall none could breach. Other women in the garden tried to speak to her, offering sympathy or whispered prayers, but she did not respond, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if seeing a judgment yet to come. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Gadsden arrived in a wagon driven by an unnamed assistant, the wheels creaking like a dirge. He went directly to the main house, where Thorne welcomed him into the study. There, by the flickering light of a single candle, they finalized the transaction, $400 in cash for ownership papers hastily drawn for an infant named Jacob, 6 months old, property of Eliza Hawthorne, now sold to Nathaniel Gadsden. At noon, Thorne sent word through Ruth, a house servant, that Eliza should bring the child to the main house. Ruth, her heart heavy, walked to the kitchen garden, her footsteps echoing in the wet earth, and delivered the command. Eliza's reaction was unexpected. She nodded, put down her hoe, wiped her dress on her hands, and walked calmly to cabin 7. She emerged minutes later,
carrying Jacob, who was awake, his eyes bright with curiosity. She crossed the yard, unhurried, her towering figure casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light. The enslaved watched, many weeping, some expecting her to run, to fight, to do anything but comply. But Eliza walked steadily up the steps of the main house and disappeared inside, her footsteps echoing through the wet halls like a knell. What happened in the next 15 minutes comes from the testimonies of Ruth, who was present, and Grimble, who was called inside during the exchange, their words preserved like relics in a forgotten liturgy. Eliza entered the study, standing just inside the doorway. Jacob clutched against her chest, his small hands reaching for her face. Thorne gestured for her to approach, his voice sharp with authority. She took 3 steps forward and stopped, her shadow filling the room, the candlelight flickering on the old wood of the desk. The men waited, but she did not move further.
After an uncomfortable silence, Thorne spoke, his voice cutting through the air. "Eliza, give the child to Mr. Gadsden." Eliza looked at Gadsden, then at Thorne, her eyes dark as a storm. In a voice so quiet they strained to hear, she said, "Please." It was the first time anyone at Willowbrook had heard her beg, a word that fell like a prayer unanswered. Thorne's face hardened, his hands clenching, as if gripping a Bible he dared not open. "You forget yourself. You do not beg. You obey. Hand over the child, this instant." For a long moment Eliza did not move, her towering form still as a statue in a forgotten church. Then, slowly, she looked down at Jacob, his small face gazing up at her. She kissed his forehead, her lips lingering, as if to imprint his warmth on her soul. She whispered something, words lost to the ages, a hymn of love and loss. And then, with hands that trembled for the first time anyone had seen, she held him out toward Gadsden. Gadsden stepped forward and took Jacob from her arms, his movements quick, as if fearing she might change her mind. The baby, sensing the shift, began to cry, a sound that pierced the room like a blade. Eliza's face crumpled for a fleeting moment, raw anguish breaking through her stoic mask, before she forced it back into blankness. Her hands, now empty, remained extended, as if unable to comprehend their loss, trembling like those of a preacher seeking grace. Thorne, perhaps feeling a flicker of guilt or simply eager to end the scene, spoke more gently. "Eliza, the child will be well cared for. He goes to a good situation. You will work, and perhaps in time you can have other children. Now go back to your work." Eliza lowered her hands slowly, her eyes meeting Thorne's with an expression Ruth later described as beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold, final, like the silence after a hymn. Then she turned and walked out of the study, out of the main house, her footsteps echoing through the wet halls, a knell that seemed to shake the earth itself.
Gadsden left Willowbrook shortly after, Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the wagon, his cries fading as they rolled down the long driveway toward the main road. Eliza stood near cabin 7, watching, unmoving, her towering figure a silhouette against the fading light, as if carved from the swamp itself. She remained there for nearly an hour after the wagon vanished, her silence a hymn of grief that needed no words. The afternoon passed in a strange, tense quiet, the plantation heavy with the weight of what had occurred. The enslaved returned to their tasks, moving mechanically through the cotton rows, their minds elsewhere, their hearts burdened with shared sorrow. Eliza worked as well, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if each task were a prayer for a justice she could not name. She refused food when offered, spoke to no one,
her face a mask that hid a gathering storm. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, she stopped working. She walked to the cabin where Marcus lay, recovering from his beating, his pallet on the dirt floor, the air thick with the scent of herbs and blood. She entered without knocking, and sat beside him, her shadow swallowing the dim light. Marcus was awake, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes alert, meeting hers with a quiet understanding. According to those who lay nearby, pretending to sleep but listening, they spoke in low voices for nearly an hour, their words a final confession, a liturgy of farewell. No one recorded their exact words, but the tone was described as resolute, as if sealing a vow that would echo beyond the grave. At one point, Marcus reached out, his hand trembling as it took hers, and they sat in silence. The only sound, the distant hum of hymns from other cabins, a chorus of sorrow and defiance. When Eliza stood to leave, Marcus spoke words that several heard clearly, their weight heavy as a judgment. "You do what you have to do." Eliza returned to cabin 7 as full darkness descended, the swamp's chorus rising, the rain whispering over forgotten graves. She did not eat the evening meal, offered by hands that trembled with sympathy. She sat on the floor, her back against the rough wall, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had built, its wooden animals silent witnesses to her loss. The single candle's flame flickered, casting her shadow like a colossus on the wall, her face illuminated with a stillness that chilled those who saw it. Around 9 o'clock, she stood, blew out the candle, and left the cabin, the door creaking shut behind her. Several saw her crossing the plantation grounds toward the main house, her figure unmistakable in the moonlight, towering, moving with a quiet grace that belied the storm within. Solomon, an elderly field worker, called out to her, his voice trembling as he asked where she was going. Eliza did not answer, her footsteps steady, echoing through the wet earth like a knell.
At approximately 9:30, according to the clock later found stopped in Eliza Thorne's study, Eliza Hawthorne entered the main house through the kitchen door, her steps silent despite her size. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of wax and brandy. Thorne had dismissed most servants early, keeping only Ruth and Isaac, an older man who served as butler. Thorne sat in his study, the same room where he had taken Jacob from Eliza's arms 9 hours before, working on his account books by candlelight, the flame casting shadows on the old wood of his desk. He sipped brandy, reviewing entries that now included $400 from Jacob's sale, his hands steady, but his eyes troubled, as if guilt lingered in the silence. Ruth was upstairs, turning down beds, her footsteps soft on the creaking floors. Isaac was in the kitchen building, separate from the main house, cleaning after the evening meal, unaware of the shadow moving through the darkened halls. What happened in the next several minutes has been pieced together from physical evidence, from testimonies of those who arrived soon after, and from Ruth, who heard sounds and came to investigate. According to her account, given 3 days later to the Savannah magistrate, she heard Thorne's voice first, raised in anger but not quite shouting, the words muffled through the walls. Then came another voice, low and steady, unmistakable as Eliza's, resonating like a hymn from a forbidden altar. Ruth, her heart pounding, moved quietly down the stairs, unsure whether to intervene, her hands trembling as if clutching a Bible. As she reached the bottom, she heard Thorne shout, his voice sharp with authority. "How dare you enter this house? Get out immediately, or I will have you whipped until you cannot stand." Eliza's response was too quiet for Ruth to hear clearly, but it provoked Thorne to shout again, his voice rising with a tremor of fear. "The child is sold. The matter is finished. You own nothing, not even yourself."
There was a sound then, like furniture scraping, as if a chair had been pushed back in haste. Thorne's voice changed, higher, laced with panic. "Stay back. Do not come closer. I am warning you." Ruth, driven by an instinct she could not name, moved to where she could see through the partially open study door. What she saw, she later swore, would haunt her until her dying day. Eliza stood in the center of the study, her head nearly brushing the ceiling, her shadow cast by the flickering candlelight like a colossus come to judgment. Thorne had backed against his desk, his face pale as death, one hand fumbling behind him as if searching for salvation. The lamp's wild shadows made Eliza's form seem inhuman, her presence filling the room like a storm. "I want my son back," she said, her voice calm as a psalm, steady as the rain on forgotten graves.
"Impossible," Thorne stammered, his voice cracking. "He is sold. The law supports me. You are my property, and that child was my property, and I had every right to—" "I want my son back," Eliza repeated, her words a litany of resolve, each syllable a step toward judgment. Thorne's hand found what he sought, a pistol kept in the desk drawer. He drew it, pointing it at Eliza with a shaken hand, his eyes wide with terror. "I will shoot you if you take another step. I swear before God, I will shoot you where you stand." Eliza looked at the pistol, her face unchanging, her eyes dark and unreadable. She took a step forward. "Stop!" Thorne's voice broke, a plea disguised as a command. "I will do it! I will!" She took another step, close enough now to touch him, her shadow swallowing the light. Thorne pulled the trigger, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space, a blasphemy against the silence. Ruth screamed, the sound lost in the echo. When the smoke cleared, Eliza stood unmoved, blood spreading across her left shoulder, black in the lamp, the ball having torn through muscle and struck bone. Yet she did not fall, did not flinch, her face showing no pain, only a determination cold as the grave. Thorne stared in horror, his hands fumbling to reload the pistol, but they shook too badly to manage it. Eliza reached out, her massive hand closing around the weapon, taking it as easily as one might take a toy from a child. She threw it across the room, where it struck the wall and clattered to the floor, its echo a hymn of futility. "Where is my son?" she asked, her voice soft as rain on forgotten graves. "I do not know," Thorne whispered, backed against the desk. "Nowhere left to run. Gadsden took him. I swear I do not know." Eliza stood silent for a long moment, blood dripping from her shoulder, pattering on the floor like a sacrificial offering. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of eternal judgment. "You took everything from me. You took my body, my labor, my dignity, my child. You took everything. What do you have left to take?" "Please," Thorne begged, his voice a whimper, his hands raised as if in supplication. "Please, I can get him back. I can find him. I can—" But Eliza was not listening. Her hands, vast and unyielding, reached out and closed around Thorne's head, fingers wrapping around his skull like a melon. He tried to scream, but the sound was cut off, stifled by the force of his grip. Ruth turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the wet halls, her screams piercing the night as she fled across the yard. Behind her, from the study, came a sound she later described as a pumpkin being smashed, followed by the heavy thump of a body hitting the floor, a final note in the liturgy of wrath. By the time Grimble and 2 other men arrived, perhaps 3 minutes later, the study was silent, the candlelight flickering on old wood, casting shadows that seemed to mourn.
They entered cautiously, Grimble clutching a rifle, expecting violence. What they found was worse, a finality that chilled the soul. Eliza Hawthorne lay on his back beside the desk, his eyes open, staring at nothing, his skull misshapen, crushed with such force that blood and brain matter had sprayed across the desk and books, staining the pages like a judgment written in crimson. The physical evidence was unmistakable. He had been killed by compression, by hands of extraordinary size and strength, squeezing until bone gave way. Eliza was gone. The window behind the desk, overlooking the swamps, stood open, its frame splintered as if forced by a colossus. A trail of blood led from Thorne's body to the window and into the darkness beyond. Droplets glistening in the moonlight like a path to salvation or damnation. The men stood in stunned silence, their breaths shallow, trying to comprehend the scene. Grimble took charge, sending one man to ride to Savannah to alert the authorities, another to gather the enslaved men for a search party, and posting guards to preserve the study's grim tableau. Yet even as he issued orders, Grimble knew in his heart they would not find Eliza Hawthorne. The swamps around Willowbrook were vast, dark, treacherous, a labyrinth of water and shadow where a soul could vanish forever. Eliza had killed a white planter in front of a witness, her blood marking her path. She had nothing left to lose. The search began within the hour, a chaotic scramble of men with torches and dogs crashing through the underbrush, their shouts swallowed by the swamp's silence and the whisper of rain. They searched all night, their torches flickering like candles in a forsaken church, but found no trace, no body, no clothing, only the blood that ended at the water's edge, like a line drawn in the sand of eternity. As dawn broke on August 15th, the searchers returned to Willowbrook, exhausted, empty-handed, their faces etched with a fear they could not name. The plantation seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the hum of unseen hymns, the guilt of what had happened echoing through the silence. If this tale chills thy bones, share it with a friend who craves dark mysteries, and strike that like button to honor these forgotten liturgies. Let us uncover what followed, for the mystery of Eliza Hawthorne was only beginning.
The Savannah authorities arrived that afternoon, led by Magistrate William Hujar, accompanied by the sheriff, 2 deputies, and Dr. James Pellow, a physician whose hands trembled as he examined the scene. The plantation was in chaos, the enslaved silent and terrified, Grimble overwhelmed, the air thick with the scent of blood and fear. Dr. Pellow's examination of Thorne's body was thorough, his report, preserved in Chatham County's archives, a litany of horror. Injuries consistent with massive compression force applied to the cranium, multiple fractures, brain hemorrhage, and instant death. The marks on Thorne's skull matched fingers of unusual length and width. The force required beyond the capacity of most men, a strength of an extraordinary nature that seemed to defy the laws of God and man. The investigation focused first on finding Eliza. But as days passed without a trace, the authorities turned to questioning those at Willowbrook. Ruth, her voice trembling as if confessing before a judgment seat, recounted what she had seen, her fear of retribution palpable. Isaac, the butler, corroborated her story, having heard the gunshot and seen the blood trail leading from the house. Other enslaved people spoke of Eliza's size, her strength, the years of abuse she had endured, and the sale of her child that morning. Their words, gathered under duress, painted a picture of a woman pushed beyond endurance, a mother whose love had turned to wrath. The gunshot wound complicated matters. The pistol found where Eliza had thrown it, the ball lodged in the study's wall. Thorne had shot her before she killed him, raising questions of self-defense that the law, in its cold cruelty, refused to entertain.
Could an enslaved woman claim such a right against her owner? The magistrates, hardened men of the South, grew uneasy, their hands trembling as if over a Bible they dared not open. But the law was clear. Eliza was property, and her act was murder, no matter the provocation. Marcus was questioned extensively, his body still broken from his beating, barely able to sit upright. The authorities suspected he knew of Eliza's plans, but he swore he had been in his cabin, too injured to move, and knew nothing until the commotion woke him. Several enslaved confirmed his story, their voices a chorus of truth that shielded him. With no evidence to contradict, the authorities relented, though suspicion lingered like guilt in the silence.
As word of the murder spread through Savannah and the coastal plain, it ignited a firestorm of fear and outrage. Among planters there was panic. If an enslaved woman could kill her owner and vanish, what did that mean for their dominion? Emergency meetings were called, patrols increased, new restrictions clamped on the enslaved as if chains could bind the spirit of rebellion. Yet among free black communities and those who opposed slavery's curse, Eliza's story took on a different hue. To some, she was a symbol of resistance, a mother who had struck back against an unbearable wrong. To others, a cautionary tale of the violence slavery bred, a warning written in blood. To still others, she was simply a woman whose love for her child had driven her to an act of desperate defiance. The search for Eliza stretched on for weeks, expanding beyond Willowbrook's borders. Slave catchers were hired, their dogs baying through the swamps, rewards posted in every town from Savannah to Charleston. Reports flooded in, a woman of extraordinary height seen near the Altamaha River, a giantess on a road north toward North Carolina, a tall woman seeking food at a backcountry church. But each lead dissolved like mist when pursued. Investigators found nothing, no trace of the colossus who had shaken the foundations of Savannah's order. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed her, hiding her in its dark embrace. Then, in September 1827, a letter arrived at the Savannah magistrate's office, left at a post office in Augusta, over 100 miles away, with no return address. The handwriting was crude, the spelling faltering, but the words were clear. To those seeking the woman Eliza, I am not dead. I will never return. I am going north to find my son. If any man tries to stop me, he will meet the same fate as Eliza Hawthorne. Do not follow me. The letter bore no signature, but Magistrate Huger, his hands trembling as if over a Bible, was convinced it was hers. The phrasing, the resolve, the threat, all echoed the woman he had come to know through testimony. Yet it raised more questions than it answered. Had Eliza reached Augusta, despite her wound? Was she alive, defying the odds? And most troubling, did she truly intend to search for her son? The authorities kept the letter secret, fearing it would inspire rebellion or panic. They shared it quietly with slave traders and catchers, urging them to watch for a woman of Eliza's description, especially one asking after a child named Jacob, sold in August. Nathaniel Gadsden, questioned again, confirmed he had sold Jacob to the Havard family in Charleston for $500 2 days after leaving Willowbrook. The Havards, alarmed by the tale, hired armed guards to watch their property, their fear a testament to Eliza's shadow. But as 1827 turned to 1829 and then to 1830, the search waned. No confirmed sightings emerged, no evidence of her survival. The authorities concluded she had likely died of her wound in the wilderness, her body consumed by the swamp's creatures, alligators, wild pigs, the relentless decay of that hot, wet world. The case was closed, though a warrant for her arrest lingered on the books, a ghost of justice unserved.
But the story of Eliza Hawthorne did not end with a closed ledger. Over the years, over the decades, rumors grew, whispered in slave quarters, shared in free black communities, even reported by white travelers who claimed to have seen the impossible. In 1831, a group of escaped enslaved people arriving in Pennsylvania via the Underground Railroad spoke of a woman taller than any we had seen, who guided them through forests like a spirit, knowing every hidden path. When asked her name, she said only, "I am looking for my son." In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia swore he encountered a woman matching Eliza's description, who appeared at his property's edge asking about recent slave sales. When he tried to detain her, she lifted him with one hand and cast him aside like chaff, vanishing before help could arrive. In 1838, Samuel Gilliard, a planter near the Okefenokee Swamp, wrote in his diary of his overseer's tale. He swears he saw the giant who killed Eliza Hawthorne, standing at the tree line at dusk, still as the forest itself. When he approached, she turned and vanished into the woods. He tracked her a mile, but lost her in a creek. I know not whether to believe him or blame whiskey, but he was shaken, and he is no man for fancy. To the enslaved, Eliza became a protector, her name sung in coded hymns, a spirit of resistance who guarded runaways and defied cruel masters. To planters, she was a monster, a tale to justify harsher chains, some claiming she turned cannibal in the swamps, others that she roamed mad, attacking any white soul she met. To free black communities and abolitionists, she was a hero, a mother who struck a blow for freedom and perhaps reached Canada, reunited with her son or guiding others to liberty. The truth, as with all legends, was likely sadder, simpler, yet no less profound. In researching this tale, I have pored over every document, every testimony, every scrap of evidence from that August night and the years that followed. The most likely truth, supported by historians, is that Eliza died in the swamps, her gunshot wound, described by Dr. Palo as grave, leading to infection and death within days. Without medical care, hunted by men with dogs, she likely followed waterways to evade trackers, only to succumb in the wilderness. The swamp would have claimed her body, leaving no trace. This accounts for the lack of confirmed sightings, the abrupt end of her blood trail, the silence that followed.
Yet doubts linger, like hymns behind closed doors. The Augusta letter was real, written by someone who knew Eliza's story intimately. The Underground Railroad accounts, recorded in private diaries by sober Quakers, are not easily dismissed. And then there is the final piece, a whisper from 1889, 62 years after that fateful night. Dr. Robert Hayes, a Philadelphia physician, treated a dying elderly black woman who claimed her mother was an escaped slave from Georgia, a giantess who killed her owner in the 1820s. She said her mother survived in the wilderness, aided by free black communities and Quakers searching for her son Jacob for over a decade before settling in Pennsylvania under a new name, dying in 1867. Dr. Hayes recorded this in a letter to a colleague, noting its remarkability but inability to verify. The woman died 2 days later, her name unrecorded. Was she Eliza's daughter? Did Eliza live free? The evidence is thin, a candle's flicker in the dark. Jacob's fate is clearer. Records show the Harfords raised him as a house servant in Charleston. Freed after emancipation, he became a carpenter, dying in 1891 at 64, buried outside Charleston. He carried a wooden horse carved by Marcus, named his first daughter Eliza, and told his children of his mother's defiance, a legacy etched in memory. Eliza Hawthorne, whether she died in the swamp or lived free, became more than a woman. She was a mother whose love turned to wrath, a symbol of resistance against a system that sought to crush her soul.
Her story endures because it speaks to the human spirit, to what happens when oppression pushes beyond endurance, when love becomes a fire that consumes all. We want to believe she survived, that she found Jacob, that she lived free, but history deals not in hopes, only in truths. On August 14th, 1827, Eliza crushed Eliza Hawthorne's skull and vanished, her bones resting somewhere, Georgia's swamps, Carolina's forests, or Pennsylvania's quiet earth. And so, my children, as the candle gutters and the rain weeps over forgotten graves, hear this: Eliza Hawthorne's wrath was no sin, but a mother's love turned to fire, a reckoning for a world that took all. When all is stolen, what remains but to stand unbowed before the Almighty's throne, hands trembling over a Bible, awaiting the final hymn of judgment?